I wanted to give you the
Same time.
full respect for your service as Speaker of the House in
I
Colorado.
appreciate that. Cheers to
Um,
you.
so I'm Darian Wilson, and I'm a candidate for Douglas County Commissioner, and I'll be your moderator. And last night, Lisa was the moderator, and I was the timekeeper. And tonight, she'll be the timekeeper. Lisa?
Hi, thanks so much, Darian. So, good evening, Speaker Romanoff. I'm sorry, Andrew, it's just hard, very hard. It's a level of respect. But we'll be using these signs tonight, so I'll just show them. Can you see this?
I can. Yes.
I will show them as appropriate, and it really is a guideline. We don't want you to disrupt your flow, but just know that there is an expectation.
Got it.
As Lisa said last night, we're super excited to have Senate candidates, but we also believe all politics is local. So I'm running for commissioner, and so is Lisa. And both of our seats are at large. So we're running as a team, and we would really love it if we could both earn your vote. So
my lease is almost up here in Aurora. Can I move to Douglas County? Which of you will put me up so I can vote for you?
If you'll quarantine for 2 weeks, you can have my basement. So Dana Torpy-Newman is our county chair, and she will be sharing for just briefly about a couple of really exciting upcoming events that we have. Dana?
Thank you, Darian. Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Torpy-Newman. I'm the chair of the Douglas County Democrats. I am going to share my screen. Tonight, it's not going to look so good because in the same way that my brain works, my slides are disorganized. We've all really been struggling lately with what is going on, and we have been all feeling very, very helpless about how to make an impact. This morning, Reagan Bird, who is a local activist and anti-racism trainer, made a post on social media that really struck me. She said, we have to stop focusing on like good cops and bad cops and really get down to the systemic problems that have existed in this country from way before its inception. And so I really thought about what she said. And today, several of us in the Douglas County Democratic Party have put together a series of town hall events for you to attend that will really allow us to start to figure out how to address these systemic problems. Please join us tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I'm sorry it's so late, but I had a patient already scheduled from 7 to 8, so I could not do any earlier. Many of you know I'm a clinical psychologist on the side as my day job. That event will be at 8 p.m. and it will be via Zoom. I posted the Zoom link and I'll be sending it out via a county-wide email. This will be a virtual town hall with Sheriff Spurlock. I'm going to host, and I'm very, very hopeful that our second vice chair, Karen Hester, who is an attorney who specializes in issues related to inclusion and diversity, will be co-hosting with me. So that's one event, and all of these things will be sent via countywide email and or on Facebook. Okay, wait, I'm not done sharing my screen. I have a few more. Here's my PowerPoint. I'm going to finish announcing the events, and then I'm going to introduce the Slido. Lisa and Darian had actually already arranged an event that we are so fortunate to have. Sorry, I told you, disorganized mess. My brain is organized, just not my desktop. They will actually be hosting a virtual town hall with Attorney General Phil Weiser on Monday at 5 p.m. There is a link. I'll add all of the links to the chat as well for you to RSVP and get the link to join that. And remember that the Attorney General's office also is responsible for helping to get the laws in place so that we can fight systemic racism. Finally, we will also be hosting, I'll just wait for this slide because I'm too disorganized with my slides. We will also be hosting a JD18 forum with our Democratic primary candidates, Matt Malaro and Amy Patton, on Thursday, June 18th from 7 to 9 p.m. This is in lieu of the Highlands Ranch District meeting. This will also be virtual. We are so lucky to have as the moderator for the JD18 forum the ACLU policy director, Denise Mays. I am thrilled that we will have such an expert helping us to really navigate through how does the district attorney help address these issues related to social justice and systemic racism. So these are the three events that are scheduled to address these issues in a more global fashion. I am very, very excited about this. I also wanted to point out that the Roxborough Indivisible group has put together a Hope and Change fundraiser for this Sunday from 4 to 6. It is also virtual. As you can see on the left side of your screen, Andrew will be there, as will many of our other elected officials and the majority of our local county candidates. The purpose of this event is to benefit our Douglas County candidates and the Food Bank of the Rockies. This is so, so important. If you think about what goes on in Douglas County day after day, I'm disgusted endlessly by our elected officials. Please support our local candidates so we can get them out. I would like to evict them from the earth. I don't think we have that option, but we'll see. I'd actually like to send them to an island since we won't go there. I also want to point out that Darian and Lisa last month put together an amazing food drive to benefit the Douglas and Elbert County Task Force, the Help and Hope Center. It was so successful that they are doing it again in June and every other month. And so we've worked out some of the bugs in this, so it's going to be even better than it was. And our hope is to collect even more donations than we did in May. There will be collection sites throughout Douglas County. That will be between June 12th and 16th. And on the 17th, we'll ask for some drivers to pick up the donations and head to the Help and Hope Center to drop them off. And then Darian and Lisa are also hosting a virtual coffee with I like to call him not only Congressperson Jason Crow, but also House Impeachment Manager, because we're pretty proud of the work that he did. That will be Saturday, June 13th at 10 a.m. This is yet another way in which we are talking to a local legislator who will help via actual policy disseminate, no, not that word, break apart our systemic racism. It's been quite the week already. Finally, I really want more participation from the party. And in order to do that, I think I need more information from you. And so I'm going to encourage you right now to hold up your phones to the screen and to hold the QR code up and participate in our survey for the night, which is letting us know how you want the party to help you. What do you want the party to be doing? Examples of that would be, supporting our local candidates, providing you with a sense of community. The password for tonight is in honor of Andrew, so it's #Andrew. And we will be posting the results of this and the survey question that we asked last night. This allows us to differentiate what night we collected the data on, because some of us scientists like to know when the data was collected and the different groups that were collected from. So we will be posting those on Facebook, hopefully once we get the results. Thank you, Andrew, for letting me take a few minutes of your time. And
absolutely. Thanks for the hashtag. It's the first time I've been a hashtag.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I've been called worse.
So the ground rules for tonight is that will be the same as last night. We ask that you use 3 minutes for your introduction, and then try to stay to about 2 minutes for each question, and again 3 minutes for wrapping up at the end. And like I said, Lisa will be keeping time as a guideline. But we are also thankful that so many folks are on the call tonight. And so please, those of you who are listening, if you if you think of your own question and you don't hear your question being answered, please put it in the chat, and we will get to as many of the questions as we can in the chat at the end. And my understanding, Andrew, is that you will respond to those questions that we don't get to later. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay, sorry. So now that we have an idea of how the evening is going to flow, please take it away with your introduction.
Thanks, Darian. Thanks, Commissioner Wilson, Commissioner Neil Graves, Madam Chair. Thank you all for joining me and allowing me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. I know this is an extraordinary time, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the horror in Minneapolis and the daily reminder that we live in an era of profound injustice. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that tonight. We did earlier tonight. I just hosted a virtual town hall, and I'll make this pitch in case we run out the clock. If you want to join me or learn more about our campaign, you can go to andrewromanoff.com. We hold town hall meetings every Tuesday at 5, every Friday at noon. I aim to be the most transparent, accountable, responsive senator Colorado has ever seen. And Cory Gardner, frankly, has lowered the bar. I hope we don't have to spend too much time talking about the junior senator, but as you know, he hasn't held a town hall meeting in more than 2.5 years. I'm really grateful to the Douglas County Dems, not only because I won the caucuses in the county assembly, but also because you're doing the heavy lifting here. I remind my colleagues in the House when I led the Democrats to our first majority in 30 years, our first back-to-back majorities actually since 1960, that when it comes to winning elections in Colorado, you don't have to carry the county in order to get credit. And the Douglas County Dems, since the very first day 25 years ago, when I was marching in a parade with a lonely band of Douglas County Dems, have really done the work, often unsung, unpraised, unheralded, but you're turning this county and in turn the state around. So I want to just say thanks for what you do. I'm running for the U.S. Senate because I'm not content to stand by while more people in the richest nation on the face of the earth struggle and suffer and die on account of problems we can fix. And if you take nothing else away from my brief presentation, I just want to underline this point. Going back to normal isn't good enough. Business as usual wasn't working even before the pandemic hit. Not when African Americans in the United States held only 1/10 the wealth of white families as they do now, and not when the gap between rich and poor is wider than at any point in 100 years, not when we've emitted more pollution in the last 40 years than in all of human history. A lot of these problems predated the pandemic. They've certainly been exacerbated by it and exposed by it. But my point is this: if we just replace Cory Gardner with somebody who pursues the status quo, we're not going to actually lift the country out of the crises we face. The climate emergency, the healthcare crisis, the profound economic inequality that confronts us, the epidemic of gun violence that plagues so many families across the United States, including mine. I think what you ought to demand from the person you send to replace Cory Gardner is someone who brings both a set of legislative skills and a sense of urgency. Someone, in other words, who will act as if our lives depend on it, because they do. You're muted there, Darian. I'm sure you're saying nice things.
Sorry, I didn't want you to hear any background noise while you were talking, so I apologize. Thank you so much for that. Now we're going to dig into our questions, and they get pretty heavy right from the start. Everyone's been talking about racism and Black Lives Matter recently. What is our collective responsibility to ensure that we stop the dehumanization of Black people?
Well, one is to recognize that this is a phenomenon even older than the United States. It is our original and persistent sin. And it is therefore, to my mind at least, our collective responsibility to remedy it. To me, the theme of racial injustice crosses every single issue of public policy. We've been spending a lot of time in my campaign talking about the role that racism plays in not only criminal justice, but education, employment, housing, banking, healthcare. I have some experience here because I joined a state civil rights agency to supervise an undercover investigation of employment discrimination. When I turned 21, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama to join the Southern Poverty Law Center in its fight against the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups. And I'll say this, in some ways, it was easier to see the racism in that context because it wore a hood and burned a cross on your lawn. The insidious role that racism plays in every walk of American life is just as pernicious, but sometimes at least harder to spot. This crisis that we're facing now isn't new, but has become more apparent, I think, to more Americans who are now waking up at long last. You asked what we can do about it. And to my mind, at least, it starts by recognizing it and then by forcing a very serious and tough and uncomfortable conversation on the part of a lot of Americans who have dodged it. I want to be clear. Donald Trump didn't invent bigotry in America, but he has certainly legitimized it and weaponized it and perpetuated so much damage, in part because of the allies in the US Senate who are content to turn the other way. When I look at Cory Gardner, I see somebody who has been complicit in his silence. All it would take is for a few women and men of courage in the Republican Party today to stand up and say, no, this is not who we aspire to be. But it's not only Republicans or even office holders who bear this responsibility. To your point, Darian, it's all of us. And it's a commitment I've taken throughout my career and one I hope to continue in the U.S. Senate. You're back to mute.
I'm sorry,
unmute yourself.
it didn't click.
That's right.
So moving on to COVID, with the influenza outbreak in 1918, we saw an initial peak and then a dip and then another peak. So what are 3 policies, core initiatives that you would like to see to get out in front of it so that doesn't happen again, that we don't have an even bigger spike this fall?
Well, one, we need a much more aggressive round of testing, followed by tracing and isolation. We need treatment, clearly, even in the absence of a vaccine. Nobody should have to go without the treatment they need because they can't afford it. And the third step I'd suggest, and it's really the most critical, not just to address this pandemic, but every other healthcare crisis in America, we need a system of Medicare for all. There's a real point of division in this race, not just between Cory Gardner and me. Gardner opposes Medicare for all and demonizes it as socialism, but even between Mr. Hickenlooper and me. I know you heard him. I hope you asked him last night. I've been having a tough time getting him to answer anything. But he uses the same talking points to demonize this plan too. In fact, he compares Medicare for all and the rest of my progressive agenda to, in his words, the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. It's an outrageous attack. It's going to be hard enough for us to adopt a plan like I support of universal single-payer healthcare, hard enough when we face Republicans. It'll be almost impossible if we have to battle corporate Democrats too. So look, at this time when 44 million Americans are underinsured and 28 million are uninsured and another 43 million may lose the coverage that comes with the jobs that are disappearing, it's time for us to say as a nation that tethering your health insurance to your employment doesn't make sense. We ought to be able to get the care we need, whether we change jobs or lose jobs or start a new job altogether. That's the plan that I support. To get from here to there, of course, we're going to have to break the stranglehold that the health insurance and drug companies have right now on Congress, too often on both parties. We got to change the way that we finance these campaigns because until we do that, we're going to continue to see the same corporate interests bankroll politicians and block reform.
Okay, thank you. Well, you kind of answered my next question, but maybe you can go into more detail. We're moving from COVID to healthcare, a natural next step. And the Affordable Care Act does not support a single payer healthcare system. Should it, and why or why not? So do you want to answer that question, even though you've just addressed that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't want to shortchange the progress we made over the last 10 years. I'm glad that insurance companies, at least by law, are no longer allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of pre-existing conditions. I'm glad we've expanded Medicaid. I'm glad young people can stay on their parents' plans until they're 26. But the painful truth is the Affordable Care Act is not affordable enough. I mentioned the number of Americans who are uninsured or underinsured. Another 500,000 families in the United States, as you know, go bankrupt each year because they can't afford their medical bills. And 35,000 Americans die in the richest nation on earth because they can't afford to see a doctor. It doesn't have to be this way. It's not this way in other industrialized nations. If you go to Japan or Germany or France or Singapore or Taiwan, Canada, you'll find those countries have figured out a way to cover all of their people at about half the cost. And we're leading the world in spending, but not in life expectancies. We haven't reduced infant or maternal mortality rates to the lowest level in the industrialized world, and we should. We've got some of the best doctors and nurses and healthcare facilities in the world, and that's great for those who can afford it. But when you are fighting for your life, you shouldn't have to worry about how to pay for it. The plan I support would do a few things. One, it would strengthen Medicare by adding benefits that aren't part of the package now. like dental and vision and hearing and long-term care. Second, it would improve Medicare reimbursement rates, particularly for rural providers who are having a tough time making ends meet. And third, it would lower the age of Medicare eligibility to 0, which was the original game plan. If you go back to 1965 and ask the proponents whether they intended to declare victory when they got seniors covered, they said no. Thank God, if you get to be 65, you've got coverage that can't be taken away. But what if you're 64 or 63, or what if you're 26 and you just aged out of your parents' plan? This system isn't really a system at all. It's just a patchwork we've created. It's not the most efficient. And I think we need to get to a place of Medicare for all. I'm the only candidate in this race who supports universal single payer healthcare.
Okay, thank you. So, so moving from there, some concerns about healthcare, the cost. So what policies do you support for federal debt management?
Well, a few steps I think we could take. The best way to balance the federal budget is to grow the economy, to help more people get the jobs they need, and in turn to supply the revenue that we require to fund the services that people want. So I put together a plan for economic prosperity, expanding jobs. On my website, if you go to andrewromanoff.com/priorities, you'll see that near the top of the list. I think we ought to take a look at some of the things that are driving the expenses in the federal budget. I mentioned healthcare. We're spending about $11,000 per person per year on healthcare in the United States, whereas our competitors in other industrialized countries are spending closer to $6,000 per person per year. So we could save some money if we actually recognize that our model is flawed and put a greater priority on prevention and early intervention. I'll put in a plug here for mental health. I led a group called Mental Health Colorado, as you know, for the last 4 years, and it's one place where our failure to address brain disease has really carried catastrophic costs for every part of American society. So that's another place where I think we could save money and save lives. And the third point I'd make is, in addition to growing the economy and tackling healthcare costs, we ought to put every part of the federal budget, including the military budget, under scrutiny. One of the best proposals I've seen along these lines came from a congressman in Vermont, not the one you might be thinking of, but a guy named Peter Welch, who said, when we're authorizing a military expenditure, we ought to include the cost of helping people resume civilian life when they come home. Because that tragedy we face now, when so many of our veterans are dying by suicide or left to live under bridges or on park benches, is immoral. And if instead we calculated the cost of mental health care, of housing, of employment, of training and support, one, we'd have a truer picture of the cost of going to war. And second, we might be less likely to go to war in the first place.
So thank you. So you mentioned growing the economy. So what is your plan for reinvigorating the economy post-COVID and given the downturn? What ideas do you have for tackling that?
Well, I think this is a New Deal moment for America. I'd like to make it a Green New Deal, because we could put millions of people back to work building a clean energy infrastructure and combating the climate crisis at the same time. Let's take a page from FDR. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps. We need a Climate Conservation Corps. Think of how many jobs we could create if we employed people in transforming our electrical grid, our building codes, our transportation system, investing in the research and development of wind and solar and other renewable energy sources. We're paying already $650 billion a year, by the way, in direct and indirect subsidies for oil and gas and coal. I'd rather put that money, instead of subsidizing pollution, into attacking the climate emergency and creating more employment along the way. Part of that, by the way, means helping workers in the oil and gas industry transition to renewables. I don't want to force them to pick between protecting the planet and protecting their paycheck. The good news is they don't have to. There are twice as many jobs in clean energy as in fossil fuels. We ought to recognize as well that when it comes to economic prosperity, our wealth as a nation can't simply be measured by the stock market. We ought to look instead at increasing the minimum wage, which has not kept pace with inflation. I support the proposal the House has passed and the Senate has not considered, to lift the minimum wage to $15 an hour and index it to inflation thereafter. We ought to be willing to invest in education, still the best ticket to the middle class, a place where we have shortchanged services in Colorado, both in P-12 and in higher ed. We ought to also tackle the sorts of things that are dragging so many families down, like the cost not only of healthcare, but of childcare and housing. If we're serious about not simply returning to normal when we emerge from this pandemic, we can create an economy that works for all of us. But that in turn requires us to create a government that works for all of us. And we don't have a government like that right now.
So your last statement actually segues really well into my next question, which is about equity. During the last recession, the recovery was not even among the wealthy and the poor. So, what do you think are the main causes of income inequity, and how do we address those causes?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think it's one that we've shortchanged throughout this debate. I mentioned earlier the gap, not only between rich and poor, wider than at any point since the 1920s, but also the gap between African American and white families. That is, in large part, the product of centuries of discrimination. And we simply can't declare victory when we put civil rights laws on the books if we don't actually enforce them. I work for a state civil rights agency investigating employment discrimination in the labor market. We found too often African American applicants denied jobs that went to less qualified white counterparts. So if we're serious about addressing inequity, we ought to recognize the racial component, and we ought to provide reparations. I know there's a proposal in Congress, at least to start that discussion. I think that's appropriate. We ought to make sure as well that the people who are making these decisions in Congress actually reflect the communities they serve. That's not happening now. And I'll just stick with the US Senate here because that's the job I'm applying for myself. There might as well be a sign hanging outside that chamber that says only millionaires need apply. As long as both parties perpetuate the kind of pay to play politics that's corrupted Congress and soured Americans on participating, we will continue to narrow the pool of candidates who run and those who win and warp the decisions they make as a result. It's not an accident that tax cuts have benefited largely those at the top, or that the nation's biggest corporations have figured out a way to avoid paying anything at all. It's in part because the wealthiest and the best connected Americans have figured out it's simply cheaper to buy a congressman. I know this is a family show, so I want to find a more polite term to describe what I think amounts essentially to a form of legalized bribery. It's corrupt. And it's not just the Republicans at fault. We need a senator for the rest of us, too.
All right. So that leads well into, I'm going to take a break from my questions for just a second and take one from the audience, which is from Jenny. And she asks, Corey will have NRA and oil and gas money for nonstop commercials, and they're already on the air. Where will your campaign find the cash to fight Corey?
Well, was it Jenny who asked that question?
Jenny.
Yeah, so Jenny, I'm going to ask you to help me. And actually, all the 120 Douglas County Dems, let me count, who are on the call, 112 right now. Look, let's be clear. Whoever wins the Democratic nomination will find himself with a lot more friends the next day. Progressives around the country will unite behind the nominee. I'll support Mr. Hickenlooper if he wins the primary, and he's pledged to support me too. You can look, for example, at Ted Cruz's contest in Texas when he was running for re-election as probably the most hated Republican in the Senate. His opponent succeeded in raising $80 million from folks all across the country without taking money from PACs or special interest groups. I think we have the same opportunity here. Beto O'Rourke didn't win that race, of course, but he managed to inspire Americans and almost topple Ted Cruz. In the case of Colorado's contest, you're right. Cory Gardner has benefited from $4 million of spending from the NRA. He and John Hickenlooper both have taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in the course of their careers from the oil and gas industry. I've signed the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge. I'm the only candidate in this race to have done so, the candidates who are remaining. But to be honest, the fossil fuel industry isn't offering me any money. Anyway, if you're an insurance company, a drug company, an oil company, you've got other preferences in this contest. So we're not taking that cash. We're asking individuals to chip in instead. We've raised about $3 million so far, just from individual contributions, 80% from people in Colorado, 100%, by the way, from humans, since we're not taking the corporate cash. And even though the National Party outfit has put its thumb on the scale of this race, they've assured me that they'll support my candidacy should I win the nomination. By the time the general election rolls around, you'll be sick of seeing my name on TV because we will have blanketed the airwaves.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder to those of us who joined late, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. Thank you. So yeah, take a sip of water, please. Anytime you need to pause, just let us know.
I'm trying to talk fast because I know Lisa's got those cue cards that are going to silence me if I go over here.
Thank you so much for getting through all these questions so quickly.
Sure.
So do you think there are benefits to a flat tax? And if so, what are they? A flat
Well, Colorado, you're saying a flat or a VAT?
Flat, F-L-A-T, sorry.
Now, Colorado has a flat tax. There's a proposal on the ballot actually to change that to create a progressive income tax in Colorado. There's a progressive income tax in America. I think it ought to be actually more equitable, more progressive, because it's been tilted against those in the middle and at the bottom in favor of those at the top. And to my mind, at least, reversing the Trump tax cuts that have doled gazillions of dollars on people who don't need them, in many cases haven't even asked for those advantages, is not the way to create an economy that works for all of us.
Okay. Let's move to education. Do you support free public college? And if so, what is your plan to pay for it? I have a college student, so I'm particularly interested in this question.
You say you are a college student, or you
No,
have?
I have a college student.
I'm just giving you a compliment. So, I do, and there are proposals from Senators Warren and Sanders that would fund that proposal. I will be candid here. I don't think it's reasonable for us to expect the feds to pick up the tab for the entire cost of higher education for all Americans. There's got to be some state responsibility. When I was the Speaker of the House, I led the fight to reform Tabor, succeeded in putting a measure on the ballot in 2005 that provided at least a temporary relief from the taxpayer bill of rights and helped shore up funding for schools and colleges across Colorado. Important to me, not just as a legislator, but as a community college instructor. Important for us to recognize that when you shortchange public education at any level, you lose a lot of good teachers and families who decide to go elsewhere to other states that make those investments. So I think we need permanent fiscal reform. I went back to the ballot and fell short in 2008. And then we had Mr. Hickenlooper, who presided over a period of neglect, didn't identify Tabor as a problem, did nothing to fix it. Now we're back in the boat of having to slash more than $3 billion from the state budget, in part because we didn't take action under his watch. I'm not blaming Mr. Hickenlooper for the pandemic, but I will tell you, I worked hard to create a rainy day fund for public schools in Colorado. Kerry Kennedy was the state treasurer, and I teamed up on that proposal in 2008. We didn't get it passed, and if we had, I think instead we would be able to better fund schools and colleges in Colorado. Across the country, I think we ought to recognize that once upon a time in America, a high school diploma might have been enough to support a family, get the kind of job that would pay well, and even allow you to save up for retirement or buy a home. Those days are largely gone. It doesn't mean everybody needs or wants a four-year degree. Most Americans actually don't get one, but some kind of post-secondary training, job training, vocational training of some kind. I taught in the community college system, as I mentioned. I think that's the commitment we need to make as a country. And in turn, the job opportunities that emerge from that investment will generate enough revenue to cover the costs. Obviously, nothing here is free. So when we talk about free public college, we got to make sure that we invest the tax dollars into paying for it. But I think instead of aspiring to be the cheapest place in America, in the world to do business, we ought to remain the most productive, the most ingenious, the most innovative, the smartest place. And part of that means investing in education.
Thank you. The next question is again from the audience. Would you support repealing the Hyde Amendment?
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate?
If you believe, as I do, that reproductive health is part of healthcare, then discriminating on the basis of income when it comes to a woman's right to choose an abortion is not acceptable. That's why I support the repeal of that amendment. And I'll take one step further. I will not consent to any judicial nominee who refuses to accept Roe v. Wade as settled law. I don't think you and I would accept a judicial nominee who either refused to answer that question or refused to weigh in, say, on other cases like Brown versus the Board of Education. And we should not allow this president or any other to stack the courts with judges or justices who undermine the rights of Americans,
Okay.
including that right.
Along the lines of rights for women, will you sign an oath to believe survivors?
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to move to the next question?
Survivors, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the work I've done.
Survivors of sexual harassment. I apologize for not being more.
No, it's fine. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the work I've done in this field because it's pretty important to me. So I work very closely with the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence on a series of bills that we passed on my watch because we believed survivors. And I'll tell you, this wasn't an easy struggle. We had a lot of opposition. I sponsored, for example, a piece of legislation that said, if you're the survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault, you need time off of work, you ought to be able to take it without losing your job. The business community rained holy hell on the Capitol and said, you have no right to tell us who we should fire or for what reasons. We withstood their lobbying and passed that bill. So today in Colorado, at least under current law, you can take time off of work to go to court, to get a restraining order, take your kids to a safer place, go to a locksmith to change the locks. You shouldn't have to pick, in other words, between protecting your family and protecting your paycheck. I also sponsored legislation that created an address confidentiality program so that the survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault could keep their address confidential when registering to vote. You shouldn't have to choose between exercising your right to vote and revealing your whereabouts to the perpetrator. That's important. And I sponsored another piece of legislation that said if you're an employer and an employee has a concern about her safety, you ought to be able to take out a restraining order that guards the workplace. In other words, instead of just the home being surrounded by that protective order, the workplace should enjoy the same kind of protection. I passed that legislation, I would like to tell you, because of my powers of persuasion, but it was really instead because of the advocates, including many of the survivors who came to testify at the Capitol at no small cost and were willing to make their case and share their stories and find, at least even as a member of the minority party at the time when I sponsored these laws, a reception from lawmakers of both parties. This issue, like so many others, should not fall along party lines. And I'm proud to have helped champion that cause in the State House.
Thank you. Well, you may have partially answered my next question. What is your approach to addressing institutional sexism?
Well, a couple thoughts here. First, and we actually had this conversation, I think, at one of my very first house parties in Douglas County. Well, I had to start by recognizing that as a straight white guy, I don't have the same lived experience, the same perspective, the same benefit, the same wisdom as everybody else. And I'm the product of my privilege and my experience. So what I will tell you, I will do, and what I have already done is to surround myself with people who bring different experiences and different perspectives. I built a staff as minority leader, as Speaker of the House, as president of Mental Health Colorado, and now in the course of this campaign, of people who don't look like me and didn't grow up in the same way and don't look at the world in the same way. It's telling to me, and it's a product not just of politicians, but of human nature, that you adopt the worldview of the people you spend the most time with. It's inevitable. So I want to make sure in the course of my career that I spend time with people who don't all have the same look on life. I am a lifelong feminist. I tell folks I probably wouldn't have made it to adulthood if I hadn't been, because I was raised by a single mom and I have a twin sister. But it's also been striking to me, and I had this conversation with my sister as well, that the things guys take for granted, like our bodily autonomy, is denied to our sisters. It strikes me as well that if men could get pregnant, by the way, there would be no debate over abortion rights in America. The fact that we have subjugated women in every way is largely the product of the patriarchy. So my commitment to equality is long and enduring. And to me, that means not simply finding folks to put in any position, but in top positions in my staff. And when I made decisions as well in picking the chairs of committees in the legislature, I think that's reflected in the appointments that I made then and will continue to make as a member of the U.S. Senate.
All right, thank you. So Lisa has a lighter question for us. She's asking if there's any special meaning to the elephant behind you. The elephant.
I was waiting for somebody to ask that question. There's no special meaning. My dad's a Republican, but he didn't give me that. I don't know. Oh, sorry.
No special meaning, you just like it.
Yeah, actually, every bit of art in my house is an animal. I'll pan later, except I haven't cleaned the whole place, and you can see that. I come from a big animal family. And you're right, Amy, it's the elephant in the room. That was too easy.
Yeah.
Do you guys have sound effects for this town hall?
Yeah, sorry. How's that?
Rim shot. That's nice. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question from Carol. Trying to find it in the chat. Regarding a universal.
Texted it to you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Dana texted
you all
it
the
to me, and I don't see it in the chat. But okay, so it was a question regarding a universal single-payer healthcare system. How do you see the United States going from a plan, assuming we pass it, to actual implementation of the legislation? What steps would you need to take? What steps would need to take place, and over what time period?
I think reasonable people can differ on that question, by the way, but we're never going to get there unless we put the plan on the table. One approach you could take, I'll mention the plan I favor, is to lower the age of Medicare eligibility. So we started at 65 and we got stuck there 55 years ago. We could go to 55 to 45 to 35, eventually bring everybody under this universal risk pool, which, by the way, is the point of insurance, right? To spread the risk. You could take another approach and start with kids. I think that makes a lot of sense too. Cover all the kids who are born in the United States and eventually get everywhere. I don't want to wait. I think this is a big difference in this race as well. Mr. Hickenlooper parrots the insurance industry just like Cory Gardner and suggests that Americans are somehow wedded to their private for-profit health insurance. I haven't met a lot of folks in that category. I met a number of folks who liked their insurance until they had to use it and they found out it didn't cover what they thought. And I've certainly met lots of folks who are attached to their providers, to their doctors, their nurses, their specialists. The beauty of a single payer plan is that by definition, all of those providers would be part of the network. That's not the case now. You can't always keep your provider or your plan, even if you like it, because your employer has the right to change plans and the insurer themselves has the right to decide which providers are in that plan. I just want to share a quick story with you to illustrate my commitment to this cause and where I come from. I spent 4 years meeting families across the state who've been devastated by mental illness or drug addiction or suicide, as my family was. I met a dad in particular whose story sticks with me to this day. His son had deep depression and then experienced a bout of psychosis, needed treatment. The insurance plan was supposed to cover it. But when the dad submitted a claim, the insurance company said no. So the dad appealed the decision and the company said no. And the dad appealed again. This went on for months until his son killed himself at the age of 14. 3 weeks later, his dad got a letter in the mail from the insurance company reversing its decision and agreeing to cover his late son's treatment. So I will tell you, speaking not as a candidate, but just as a human being, it is profoundly, personally painful to me to have conversations with moms and dads who have lost their kids, not just to a disease we can treat, but also to the indifference of an industry that bases its profits on its ability to deny as many claims and exclude as many sick people as possible. That's the business model. And it's a great model if you're an insurance company. It's a pretty lousy model for the rest of us. So yes, I support universal single payer coverage. I think it's time we take a lesson from the rest of the industrialized world instead of condemning ourselves to a dysfunctional system that leaves too many Americans uninsured or underinsured or dead.
Okay, thank you. Again, going back to the questions from the audience, what will you do to ensure that a Green New Deal will not do harm to people who've been marginalized and oppressed? The New Deal had racist and oppressive policies, the original New Deal under FDR, that exists even today.
Yeah, this is a fair challenge, and you're right. I mean, sometimes the shorthand we use to describe these plans underestimates the flaws in the original programs. So I'd say a couple things. I mean, one, if you read the resolution itself, and it's not very long, just a few more than a dozen pages, It's an aspiration, right? I mean, the New Deal itself is not a piece of legislation, but it does lay out a vision, which I support. And part of that vision includes exactly what this question reflects: the inclusion, not in some token fashion, but in a genuine participatory way of communities who are affected. We should take a lesson, for that matter, from the Native American and other indigenous populations who have figured out a way to be much better stewards of the land than we have. That's key. It also includes provisions for the protection of communities that have borne the brunt of oil and gas development. I look at families living in the frack zone, who have seen an uptick in the rate of birth defects, deterioration in air quality, and breathing problems that come with it, and are wondering why on earth we'd replace Cory Gardner with somebody who sued their communities when they tried to protect their public health. Somebody like John Hickenlooper, who actually drank the fracking fluid. Not a metaphor, just a bad idea. So yes, including communities in this conversation and protecting against the failures of, as this question reflects, the previous programs, is essential in my view. And the good news in this conversation, and there is some good news here, is that most Americans support this plan. If you get outside the fossil fuel industry and the politicians on their payroll and ask people, don't you think we ought to be protecting public health, improving air quality, helping families thrive, creating good jobs, taking global leadership in this field, recognizing what science teaches us about the threat we face from the climate crisis? Most Americans agree. There's a climate scientist, actually, Professor Kay, who said a thermometer is not liberal or conservative. She's right. One last point. Even if you didn't believe the science, you might take some interest in the likelihood that pandemics like this one will become more frequent, because these warmer temperatures are driving the spread of disease-carrying species around the world. And it's often low-income communities, including communities of color here in the United States, that bear the consequences of runaway pollution. I know they don't always have as much political power. That's part of the problem. One of the reasons that Suncor, for example, north of Denver, has been able to spew so much hydrogen cyanide is because they're not as politically well equipped to fight it. Or the Bella Romero Academy, the neighborhood there, which got stuck with a fracking site that was off limits to a white community that protested. So there's a real connection here in this conversation between economic inequality, environmental injustice, and political power. And it's why it's not enough simply to flip a seat from red to blue if we're going to perpetuate the same problem. We've got to stand up to what amounts to a form of institutionalized racism, whether it takes place in the criminal justice system or, in this case, in environmental policy, and pay, back to this question, a profound, not only respect, but real regard for the interests and the autonomy of the populations that are the most deeply affected here in the United States and around the world.
Thank you. From Federico in the questions, the press is under attack in the United States. Do we need stronger protections for the press? And if so, what do you propose?
Yes. Look, I mean, of all the damage the president has done, and it's going to take us a lifetime to calculate the casualties here, his success in delegitimizing and demonizing the news media is profoundly dangerous. Not only because it makes it impossible for us to ever conduct a civil debate that's grounded in the evidence, although that's true, but also because of the threat of physical violence, and not just a threat. I mean, you've seen reporters assaulted. I've been at events. I was, for example, at the memorial service after the STEM school shooting, and you heard some of the antagonism that was directed there against members of the news media, egged on in part at a national level, not in this context, but generally, because of the president's description of the news media as enemies of the people. I mean, it's surprising to me in a way that more violence hasn't followed the president's threats. I used to be an amateur journalist. I was the editor of my college paper. I thought I was going to pursue a career along those lines. And it is one of the last bulwarks of democracy. The reason the president hates the press so often is not because they're fake, but because they're telling the truth about him. And he doesn't like it. So he has told his followers, literally, don't believe anything you see, anything you read, anything you hear. Believe only me.
I mean, that's not the mark of a democratic leader. It's the mark of a tyrant and a demagogue. And again, the most damning part of this administration, in some ways, is not the president's conduct alone, although it's reprehensible. It is the complicity of his allies in Congress. When Cory Gardner was asked to respond after this president incited violence, gassed protesters, and threatened a military crackdown across the country, a few timid Republicans eked out a couple of words of dissent. They said, "It's not helpful. It's not constructive." That's the most they could chirp. From Cory Gardner, you got crickets. He said, "We all have to do better each day." That's it. From a senator who promised that when something was broken, he would fix it. When his party was wrong, he would say it. We've seen a complete and utter abdication. That's why I describe Cory Gardner as Colorado's invertebrate senator.
Thank you for that. Amy Ross is wondering if you support eliminating the Electoral College.
Yes, I do.
Would you like to elaborate, or do you want me to move on to the next?
Well, it's a pretty simple proposition. I think the first person who gets the most votes should win and be inaugurated.
Okay. So the next question from Carol again is, what would you do to address gun violence in schools, public places, and homes in the United States?
I'm glad you expanded that question, because we ought to recognize that this death toll is not confined to a single spot. We're losing 100 Americans a day to gun violence. And I recognize that if you're in the gun lobby, you'd say, you can't stop every shooting. You're right, maybe we can't. But surely there are some steps that we can take to reduce the slaughter, like universal background checks, a ban on high-capacity magazines and military-style assault weapons, stronger enforcement of existing laws like the ban on straw purchases, which says you can't buy a gun on behalf of somebody else. I helped lead the legislature, and I know you have Tony Spurlock as one of your guests, in passing a red flag law. I should say I wasn't in the legislature at the time. I was leading Mental Health Colorado, but making the case that that was one means of preventing suicide. And when we're talking about gun violence, we ought to recognize that 2/3 of the gun deaths in the United States and 3/4 here in Colorado are suicides. So sure, we can't stop every shooting, but I can tell you from personal experience, for my family and me, on January 1st, 2015, when I lost a little cousin I thought of as my kid sister to suicide, if on that day in America, if there had only been 99 gun deaths instead of 100, our lives would be forever changed. It's one of the reasons that I not only oppose Cory Gardner's complete acquiescence to the gun lobby, but I'm also deeply puzzled by John Hickenlooper's abandonment of conviction as well. He signed a ban on high-capacity magazines and then apologized to critics. You can look up the video if you don't believe me. Just Google Hickenlooper and sheriffs. He was confronted by a group of opponents, sheriffs who said to him, the law you signed, this ban on high-capacity magazines, was essentially worthless. This is a law, by the way, that cost 3 legislators, as you may remember, their jobs several years ago. And instead of defending the legislation, Hickenlooper said, I wouldn't argue with you. And then he said something I've never heard a governor say, and I've known several governors. He said, I only signed the law because one of my staff members promised that I would. And to be honest, he said, we never really thought it was going to pass. And then he said, if I had known it was going to be so divisive, we might not have signed it in the first place. That is not, to be blunt, a profile in courage. And it ought to make you wonder, at least it makes me wonder, what happens when you get to Washington, where the gun lobby is even more powerful, where they're spending millions of dollars to bribe members of Congress and block reform. I know Cory Gardner's a lost cause on this front, but I, for the life of me, don't know what John Hickenlooper will do in those circumstances. It is, to me, a performance that was almost disqualifying. And I hope we'll have a chance to debate it. I know you've had us now in separate forums. Mr. Hickenlooper has gone 9 months without answering a single question from any of his opponents. There were about 20 of us in this race at one point. Almost all of us showed up for the candidate forums to which we were invited. This issue was front and center in many of them. But Hickenlooper, unfortunately, has hidden from public view and the advice of, I suppose, of his handlers in Washington. And we don't need another senator like that. If you wanted a senator who doesn't show up or answer questions, well, we already have one. His name's Cory Gardner.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question from the audience, and then you can do your closing if you don't mind. One of the questions came up last night as well. what are your thoughts about a universal basic income?
Yeah, I'm glad.
The question asks if it would bring value and alongside a Green New Deal mobilization, and it's from Braden.
Yeah, so look, I think it's pretty clear we need a basic income now, and it needs to be universal, and it's got to be more than just a $1,200 check for 1 month, right? I mean, families need more than that to survive. My policy team, I should say my policy director and I, are trying to hash out a plan for what a universal basic income would look like going forward post pandemic, because it is an idea whose time may have come. It's not a new idea. Even President Nixon was contemplating a guaranteed minimum income some 50 years ago. What we're wrestling with is this: uh, how much would it be? What are the advantages of a UBI over another set of proposals that might raise the earned income tax credit or provide other assistance to families? You're right that part of this plan has to include the kind of jobs guarantee that comes from a Green New Deal. But we also recognize that a lot of the jobs in America are disappearing because of automation and increasingly artificial intelligence. And I don't think that we have sorted that out. So I'm not willing to reject the universal basic income unless I can come up with a better alternative. And I don't like not having a plan. I'm a fan of Elizabeth Warren's in that sense. I want a plan for that. We just haven't cobbled together one. So I'm taking a look at what Andrew Yang and other thinkers have been proposing.
All right, great, thank you. If you'd like to wrap it up with your final thoughts, we would love to hear them.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks to Darian. Thanks to Lisa. Thanks to Dana. Thanks to all of you who are joining this call and giving me the chance to share some thoughts with you. If we win the primary, and I'm asking for your vote, we'll win the general election too. I know there's a school of thought that says you got to pick the guy with the most name recognition or the most money because only he can beat Cory Gardner. That's not true. Even Hick himself said last year, we don't need him to beat Gardner. He's right. We don't. We ought to pick somebody who wants the job and who would be good at it. Hick said he'd be terrible at this position and would hate it. It's an odd way to begin a job interview. I will support him, as I said, if we win the nomination. And I'm not running because I think he's wrong, or although I do think Cory Gardner's just about wrong on everything. I'm running because I believe at this time, at this profound period of economic uncertainty, of racial injustice, at a time when life on Earth is literally at stake, we need leaders of genuine conviction who will not simply go along or turn the Senate cloakroom into their own private country club. I recognize that you have a choice, and I respect that because this is not a job that anybody is entitled to. It's the kind of job you have to earn. Our polling shows if people actually weigh the two candidates in this race, we win. If folks don't notice, if they don't pay attention, then it's a much tougher slog. Even a generic Democrat, of course, according to the polling, beats Cory Gardner by double digits. I'm suggesting you demand more than a generic Democrat. Each state only has 2 senators, as you know. I used to teach American government, and I'm sure this lesson is familiar to all of you. I think it is critical at this time that we not only replace the president or flip the Senate or hold the House, but we also put in these positions people who will bring a sense of urgency to this fight. There are too many folks in this nation who are suffering and dying, all on account of problems that we can fix. And I know it's easy if you get to Congress to ignore those problems. You get health benefits if you get a job like this. You get a pension plan, which most people can only dream about. You get a paycheck, even if the government shuts down. So it's easy to be insulated from the problems your constituents face. That's a mistake I will not make. My career and my campaign are grounded in the people of Colorado. We don't take money from special interest groups. I'm not the darling of the Washington establishment. And I think what voters want to know at the end of the day is if you are willing to stand up to your own party when your conscience or your constituents or the Constitution demands it. I am. I'm doing that right now. So I hope that you'll learn more about our campaign. I'd be honored to earn your vote. We have a series of televised debates that are coming up next week. Tomorrow, we're beginning our television ads. So if you want to chip into the campaign to fund those efforts, or text or phone voters, or co-host a virtual event like this one, you can learn how to do all those things at andrewromanoff.com. And I want to say thank you to Darian and to Lisa and to Dana for organizing this event. And good luck in your campaigns too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your time tonight, for the folks in Douglas County. And those of you who did not get your questions answered, Dana has made note of your questions and she will be passing them off to Andrew's campaign. At a time when things are really feeling shaky and dark in our democracy, I'm really grateful for all of you for calling in tonight and last night and for being so involved in our electoral process. Thank you so much for your time, all of you. And thank you for running, Andrew. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.